All right. Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of the Roscoe's Wetsuit Podcast. On the show today, I have a very special guest. We have Robert Grigore. Robert is a really interesting guy. He is a registered clinical counselor, a certified EMDR therapist, and proved EMDR consultant. He's also a published author on EMDR, the owner and CEO of Grigore Counselling, and the creator of Signature One and Done, a total immersion package, and One and Done legacy package. Robert, really happy to have you on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me, Toby. Appreciate it. And thank you to the listeners for allowing me to be in your ears.
Absolutely. So, you mentioned a lot about EMDR, in your bio. I'm really curious, as far as this is something that hasn't been, I don't believe, brought up in previous shows. So, maybe just for our listeners, if we could kind of give kind of an introduction to EMDR, what it is, and then sort of how you've incorporated that into your practice.
Yeah, sure. I get that asked that all the time. What is EMDR? So what it stands for is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And as you can imagine, that's a mouthful. So we just use the acronym EMDR. What EMDR is a accelerated form of neurological processing. Some EMDR therapists use EMDR as a standalone therapy as a whole, which is what I do, as well as some therapists use EMDR as a tool in their practice. So what EMDR does, first of all, I gotta say, it looks really, really strange. Pretty classically, a therapist will be sitting in front of the client and waving their hand back and forth in front of their face, and the client follows with their eyes back and forth, or tapping on the knees back and forth. And it looks very, very odd. It almost looks like hypnosis or something like that, which is not. But what EMDR does is we identify the source of somebody's distress, which would be trauma or negative experiences in one's life, and we can talk more about that in a bit. But that's the source of the distress, and what we need to do with EMDR is access both hemispheres of the brain back and forth in alternating fashion. So that allows the brain to finally process information that was not properly processed at the time of these pivotal incidents. Does that make sense so far?
It does.
Okay. It's so yeah. So I often say that EMDR is not talk therapy. I don't sit in front of my client. We don't talk for the entire time that I'm working with them. In fact, there's very little talking that happens in EMDR. Of course, we have to communicate and provide consent as to what's happening, and have to get a rough idea of what we're going to be focusing on. But when we're actually processing the desensitization and reprocessing part of EMDR, there's very little talking, which actually allows the individual to fall deeper into their felt sense rather than staying in the left side of the brain and utilizing their logical reasoning and the Broca's area where language is. And so it looks very strange, but it's very effective, and it works much, much quicker than other types of therapies.
Okay. And then specifically, so say you have a patient come in who's a good fit for this therapy. What is the actual process? Can you kind of walk me through the steps of what you are actually doing with them?
Yeah, so I'll tell you a little bit about EMDR. It's an 8-phase process. So for everybody, it's going to look a bit the same, and then I do things a little bit differently than the regular EMDR therapist. In fact, quite a bit differently. So what usually happens is immediately upon upon contact, I mean, the patient's going to talk. I'm going to find out a little bit about their history, and immediately we're going to teach some coping skills, and some people cringe when they hear that, because I always say effective EMDR therapy should mean that you don't need coping skills anymore. So what happens, but we do have to teach these preparation skills so that the individual can have something to use prior to actually desensitizing. So a lot of history taking, then we go into preparation, or we do them kind of at the same time. And then we're going to identify that the number of traumas or negative experiences that are directly related to the negative belief, which is the cause of the distress. So pretty often, I work with leaders in business and film and sports, or my three categories. So oftentimes I might get something like, I need to be perfect, or I'm worthless, or I'm unlovable, or I'm a failure. And so these are, not particular to this group of people, but this is often what I get. So that negative belief is going to be coming up quite frequently throughout the individual's life, causing enormous amounts of stress. I think about board meetings, for example, and not being able to speak up, or maybe being on a show and not being able to, to fully drop into what you want to say. All different kinds of things can happen. So we're going to identify what is the core belief of that individual's issue. Then we're going to identify all of the relevant memories that are related to that. And then when we're ready, we're going to start processing. And that's where it looks weird. And, the hand goes up and back and forth, or online, of course, with the pandemic, the individual will be following a ball back and forth instead of being in the office. And we're going to then, once that memory, let's say it's you're coming home and your father's drunk, and there's stuff smashed everywhere, or he's yelling, or she's yelling even, so that's an imprinted memory. And then what happens is the EMDR that we do, the processing, literally takes all of the pain away. So that memory is now a fact. There's still going to be maybe some emotion attached to it, because the EMDR doesn't eliminate, appropriate memory, appropriate feelings to that memory. But there's no distress anymore. It's not like you feel like you're gonna throw up every time you think about that event. Then we attach a positive belief to it, that the individual wants to believe, like, let's say, I'm good enough as I am, or I am worthy of love. And that now feels completely true when we tie that together with that memory. And then we do some checks with the body, and there's a few checks that we do to make sure that everything has been processed. But that, in a nutshell, is the whole process of EMDR. And that's what you'll get with regular EMDR therapists. And the thing that's different with me is that I used to work in what I call a pay-as-you-go format, where I'd see a client for 60 minutes here, 90 minutes there. And this process would be faster than talk therapy. I was a talk therapist for many years and got burnt out, I think, pretty quickly, actually. And I needed to find a way to help my clients, and a little bit faster. And I found EMDR. And this allowed me to shorten treatment significantly for a lot of my clients, but for a lot of my my high profile professional clients, they didn't have 3 months even to devote to therapy, when they're say running a multinational company or something like that. They don't have that kind of a time. Or so I ended up finding a way how to do this over the course of an entire just one weekend. So the entire treatment in 3 days, which has been phenomenal for my practice, for my clients. So quite a little bit different how I do it, but it's, it's fantastic.
Interesting. So you're doing kind of these like intensives
Yeah,
of
exactly. Yeah.
gotcha. So, I'm curious, as far as like if you're, say, addressing these, sort of issues, that your patients have, with say traditional psychotherapy versus EMDR, what do you feel that sort of EMDR brings to the table or enables your patients to sort of achieve that talk therapy might not?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think that my answer has evolved over the years. Initially, I thought that they were not really compatible, but now I'm finding that although most of my clients have been in talk therapy for sometimes 10, 20 years, and still not getting full relief of their issue, I do find that individuals that have experience in talk therapy uh, have developed some skills to become more self-aware. Certainly, being in talk therapy, you will learn some coping strategies and methods to lower some distress throughout your life and manage it better, which is all good. There's nothing wrong with that. But EMDR does what talk therapy can't. And when we talk about an individual constantly being triggered to think about, a past experience, like, common therapeutic question is, how did your parents help you with that experience? Or tell me about your parents, right? And so if that's distressing, the individual is going to go back into their past and relive these traumatic incidents, um, like for example, me thinking about an abusive relationship, and every time that I would think about that abusive relationship, I would be reliving it. It is trauma. And if all you do is talk about a traumatic experience, often what's happening is you could be re-traumatized and now it could be worse because there's no resolution at that time. So EMDR allows you to actually get the full resolution from that experience, not just bring it up, but actually process it from the right side of the brain over to the left side of the brain. Because during a traumatic incident, regardless of what it is, and when I say trauma, please know that I don't mean that we're talking terrorist bombing or a car crash or war or sexual abuse. We're talking anything at any time in that individual's life that was ever overwhelming and they felt powerless at the same time. So when you think about, for a bigger conversation, COVID-19, the entire world has been experiencing a shared collective traumatic experience for a long period of time. That is a trauma. Um, but what EMDR will do then is allow you to access that traumatic experience, focus on the feelings, and allow the feelings in the body to move, and the brain finally processes that experience, because otherwise it's the brain basically just pauses and basically takes a snapshot of that experience so that you never have to experience that again. And while this traumatic event's happening, the brain is operating in a survival mode, as you've probably heard: fight, flight, freeze, faint, shut down, all those things happen. And that information does not get processed by the brain. So EMDR allows you to get the full resolution, finally process what was never processed, and then you can move on with your life very quickly.
Gotcha. So I'm curious, as far as are your patients, are they usually aware of, maybe the issues, the traumatic events or experiences that are preventing them from, either feeling, happy or achieving whatever, they're trying to achieve right now? Are they pretty cognizant of that usually, or is it your job to kind of, play the detective and help them figure it out?
I'm going to go right in the middle there, because
Okay.
some of my clients are aware of having, these traumatic incidents. And I often find that the clear, what we call big T trauma, what I refer to as, the car crash or the terrorist bombing or something like that, it happened. There was a clear date and end time of that event. Um, and then there's the small T traumas, which are things that go under the radar. They're very subtle, like maybe constantly um, being belittled by a parent your whole life, and it's just normal. You don't really think anything of it, or always having to prove yourself without really. There's no major event that happened, but it's just sort of slid under the radar. Or like me, I was bullied in school on a consistent basis. I was called short, fat with glasses. That was my nickname. And over time, this becomes a small T trauma. So when I was in my EMDR therapy, I could tell my therapist that, yeah, this event happened with my ex-girlfriend, and I've been struggling with this problem for a long time, but I wasn't able to really get a clear sense of all of the things that are attached to it. Just like my clients, they may know, yeah, I had an abusive father in my childhood. That might have something to do with it. Or I know that I was in a car accident on this date, and that probably has something to do with my feelings of being afraid of driving now. But often my clients are so focused on the pain. So it's like this fog that's right in front of their face. They can't really see through it. All the client has to know is, this is what I'm struggling with. This is the feeling that I'm having. This is the behavior that I'm seeing myself do. And I will be that detective. I will assess that negative core belief. And when I find it, usually pretty quickly, that client will feel it kind of like almost like a punch in the gut, like, oh, yep, there it is. And I can tell very, by paying attention to the client's response. As soon as that belief is that it's a neurological framework that's in the brain, as soon as that becomes highlighted, all those events now become present that are related to that neurological sequence. So the brain just wants to let go of this stuff. It just wants to go there. So it's going to start bringing up all these memories. So there's a little bit of work that I do to get some things that might be a little bit stuck, but mostly the brain just wants to go as fast as possible.
Gotcha. So one of the things that, I think about, and I'm just curious your perspective on is, how are you able to tell whether, some trauma is still affecting a patient, because, you know, what, like, are there clear indicators, say, people experienced horrible traumatic things, but they were able to process them, there's like I guess I'm trying to come at it from like a scientific, like, well, how do we know if this is fully processed?
Yeah.
Um, but can we sort of answer that question?
Yes, we can. Absolutely. That's a great question. And it's a common one too, because, clients want to know, how do I know this is going to work? Right. Which is that's why we go into treatment. So everything is measured. There's a high amount of measurability with our work. So we use what's called a subjective units of distress scale. So the event the scale is, let's say, 0 distress, is mean totally neutral, doesn't have to be positive, it's just neutral. And then 10 is the highest amount of distress you can possibly imagine. And when you think about that event, then you're going to notice, where on that scale are you? And if your answer is 0, which is 99% of the time, that's what we get. Sometimes it goes to a 1 because it makes sense for that particular event, but mostly it's a 0. If that's your answer, then that has been processed. And if you fully believe that positive belief now, let's say, I am worthy of love, then we move on. And we do check, the next time that we I see that client, I check on the previous day's work. What comes up when you think about that memory now? And the answer is mostly, yeah, that was a crappy time in my life. That was a really horrible event, but it's just doesn't matter anymore. I'm past it. It's like looking at this, it's like looking out of a window before being focused on a particular part of the, say, a courtyard or something that you're looking at. And then now after EMDR, there's the courtyard's still there. The event is still there. You still know that, like, I still know I was bullied as a kid. And I can look at that memory and feel sad for my 11-year-old self, but there's no distress anymore. So I'm looking at the same event, but from a different window now.
Got it. That makes sense.
Okay.
So I guess, switching gears a little bit, I had seen something, in your bio just about, the masks that people wear. And I was wondering if you could sort of, talk a little about that. You talk about how to remove them. So what are masks in a psychological sense?
Yeah, so there's nothing in the DSM about masks that people wear, but it's just a term that I use where I, a lot of my clients find that they show up into the world before working with me wearing this mask that they believed that they thought the world wanted to see, right? Let's take a CEO, for example, and this is a really classic one for me because this, hopefully things will change, but the kind of the old mentality was that the CEO had to appear this very strong, stoic individual that had no weaknesses, and if they were to mention any kind of distress that they're feeling, any anxiety, any depression, any kind of emotional experience that wasn't joy, or maybe anger was allowed a little bit there, but if it wasn't those two things, then the others in charge of them, like say the board members, for example, might feel that they're unfit to be at the helm. And this comes up in so many other professions as well. I mean, I certainly felt it myself when I first began into my psychotherapy career. Most people heard of this as imposter syndrome, right? You want to do this thing, but you feel that maybe you're not good enough, or maybe if other people knew what you're thinking or feeling on the inside, they wouldn't accept you. You wouldn't be worthy of the job that you're doing, or worthy of that friendship, or worthy of that partner, or worthy of XYZ, you fill in the blank. So this is the mask that I help my clients to remove. We don't need to be in the world afraid of showing our true authentic selves, because that in fact gives other people the permission to also be real with each other. And when they're done working with me, their authentic self is so grounded in who they really are that it doesn't matter if somebody criticizes them. Pretty common one will be, a celebrity and posting something on Instagram or Twitter, and you get the trolls that criticize you, and you can look at that experience and just think, wow, that individual must really be in pain to make a comment like that to me. And it has nothing to do with me whatsoever. So you can then respond in compassion and love and kindness for that individual, and thank them for their opinion. It has nothing to do. So that's what I mean by removing the mask. It doesn't have to be something that you're not hiding anymore. You're being your real self.
Right, right. And yeah, I mean, from what you're saying, it sounds like, instead of, letting other people sort of dictate how you feel, you can still have, all the sort of BS that's coming in, and, but then you can choose to, you see it, but at the same time, not let it affect you as much. It kind of sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. So for many people's sense of value comes from an external source. They feel validated and valued when a producer says good job, or the board says you did a great job, or your mother says, hey, you did something really well here. And so a lot of people grow up with that external validation, whereas really where the individual needs to go is the individual themselves internally has to just know 1000% I am valuable regardless. I am worthy. I am good enough. So it doesn't matter what somebody else says about you because it's irrelevant.
Right. And I'm curious, as far as you know, with people that you see, how often are people, say, it sounds like you're working with a lot of these kind of peak performers, people who've achieved all of this, external success, but maybe there's still something internally that doesn't feel quite right. Do you feel like a lot of these people, have they gotten to where they are and achieved what they have because they're doing, what they think other people want them to do versus what they actually want to do, like the sort of external, making the external things your source of happiness versus internal? Like, do you see that play out
Yeah,
a lot?
yeah, you're exactly right that oftentimes quote unquote successful people um, are achieving that level of success because of fear. I need to be the best here, or else, or I need to make X amount of dollars at any cost because I feel like I'm going to not be able to survive. I've worked with millionaires who are worried about spending $10 on a hamburger because that is fear. So and this isn't just relevant to the leaders that I work with, but it's relevant to anybody, no matter who you are, can struggle with these same issues.
Right. Absolutely. Um, Switching gears a little bit, uh, I'm curious, as far as, you know, with working with these peak performers, what do you see, what I'm always curious asking people this, what sort of traits or behaviors, what do you observe? I get that these people are coming to you because there's something, wrong that they're trying to fix, but at the same time, you are exposed to, a lot of successful people. I'm curious just what you've noticed in your work as far as different, whether it's mindsets or actions, what enables or what separates these people from the rest of the pack per se.
Um, that's a really great question, and I think it's a really complicated one because it's going to be quite different, I think, for each person. But I think there are some qualities or some characteristics that these leaders that I work with do share. I think number one, it is a mindset, um, and that has obviously helped after working with me as well, that to remove any blocks in that mindset. But there has to be a belief in oneself that you are capable of accomplishing whatever it is that you're setting out to do. If you don't believe in that, you can't really sell out and give it your all. So that you have to believe in yourself completely. You have to not be afraid of failure. In fact, you have to not be afraid of anything. Fear is it is the killer of entrepreneurial dreams. Um, the other thing is there has to be some routines that are useful to maintain a particular state of being. So meditation, yoga, exercise, all of these things are really effective to maintain the body, maintain their mind, and get yourself into a state. Now, a lot of people do those things without doing the internal work that I do with them, and it makes it so much harder for them to drop into these particular states. Or instead of only needing maybe 15-20 minutes of meditation, they might have to do like an hour or a 2-hour workout. And sometimes these things can become addictions themselves, as the only way that I can cope with this is if I go work out. That's not healthy, right? So by removing the blocks in their mind and in their body as to whatever is holding them back, then it allows those to be even more effective. So that's some of the things. And then depending on the size of that individual's following or their organization, if I'm working with a solopreneur, then obviously that person has to wear many hats, and that then time management becomes incredibly important, and prioritizing what tasks we're going to focus on in their business. But if I'm working with somebody that has a team, then being able to delegate properly and form effective team around you, that is critical for that individual's success. Because not everybody is a finance major. Not everybody is going to be is maybe they can do it, but they're not enjoying that task. And that is such a deflator for that creative spark that the successful individual needs in order to maintain and increase their success.
Got it. Absolutely. I wanted to switch gears again a little bit, and touch on something that you'd mentioned in your profile, as far as the law of attraction. And you mentioned what you've been told isn't the whole truth. So I'm really curious to hear your take on that, because that's something that I also like endorse, like certain aspects of it, but then there's other things that like don't. So I'm just curious to hear your take on that.
Yeah. Thanks for asking. It's something that I don't talk about that often, but it is. I devoted a chapter in my book about it because I thought it was important. Um, I've been fascinated by the law of attraction as soon as I heard about it, probably 10 or 20 years ago now. And the basic premise is that what thoughts you put out into the universe, you will attract it back. And I kept wondering to myself, why is this not happening? Why am I not getting, the financial abundance that the secret talks about? Or, why am I still struggling here when I was putting this out into the universe? Well, the problem is that your brain, I view it very much as a conductor and a generator. So you put out these thoughts into the universe, and the reason why you might not get the results that you're looking for is because you're putting out two different signals or multiple signals, different frequencies. So if, for example, you say, I want $100,000, and you put that out and you imagine holding on to that $100,000, and you know use Canva and you make a check and you dress it to $100,000, and you're doing all these things that are important to have a vision board, and you're doing these things. But if underneath in your unconscious or in the back of your mind, I like to call it as an inner critic in the back of our minds, you also believe, yeah, I don't deserve that. Oh, I can't do that. Oh, I'm going to fail. Now you're putting out two different signals into the universe, and you're going to get mixed results.
Gotcha. So sort of identifying what those signals are, I guess. Um, do you feel like there's a lot of kind of misconceptions as far as, it seems like certain times people people sort of, think that, oh, like thinking positively or thinking like happy thoughts or whatever, like that's gonna make a change, but like they don't do the action to follow it up. Is that, I mean, that from my perspective, that's one of the issues, maybe not even with how it was intended originally, but just in the way people interpret that sort of like magical thinking. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that so what I'm hearing you say is that if you are, say you want to be a millionaire and you're not following through on the behaviors that would that a millionaire would behave in, then you are not allowing that to unfold. And just going a little bit deeper as to the why you aren't behaving that way is because you don't fully believe it. There's doubt in your mind and there's lack in your mind where, yeah, but I've got all these, these bills that I have to pay. And yeah, but, I'm still walking on this, I'm still using transit, or yeah, but, and that yeah, but will kill you. It will slow down the law of attraction. It will slow down the manifestations of that because you are sending out the other signal that says, I am not really believing that I'm a millionaire. So it's obviously it gets tricky when people are in tight scenarios and you have to pay your bills, and so it's not easy, but you do have to believe 100% that this is real, it's going to happen. Any doubt
Absolutely.
that's creeping in is just going to really be detrimental.
Right. Right. So you mentioned your book, and I'm curious if what was, well, I guess if we could kind of talk about kind of what is it, a EMDR book?
Yeah, it's so the title of it is You Need Therapy, kind of tongue in cheek. And then the subtitle is EMDR, Real People with Real Problems Getting Real Help. And I wrote this book as an introduction for, at the time, potential clients, and still use it for potential clients. But it's really to understand what EMDR is. I've even given it to some of my consultees, and people that are learning about EMDR from the therapeutic level to be practitioners, and they just want an extra viewpoint on it, maybe to refresh their skills. But it's really, the point of it was to talk about what, first of all, what distress is, how common is the need for therapy, and it's pretty common. A lot of more people are distressed than you might think. And my personal belief is that we are all trauma survivors, that we've all been through something that was distressing. It doesn't mean that we're all abuse survivors, or we've all been through a big T trauma, but I truly believe that nobody escapes childhood unscathed. So from that perspective, I'm really outlining, the kinds of things that can be traumatic for individuals and what's happening in the brain, and why that's being, held, why you're still feeling that distress. And then, a brief introduction as to EMDR and the different phases that we talked about earlier today. And and there's quite a bit about my own story, because I think that's an important element for individuals looking to work with a therapist, to know that the therapist has actually suffered and they have actually been in therapy themselves, and etc. And then for individuals that are looking to find an EMDR therapist, for them there's a section as to how to go about doing that. Um, and of course, there's statistics as to how effective EMDR is for people, and studies that have been documented and published that show that EMDR is incredibly effective, and oftentimes much more than regular talk therapy or medication, and things like that.
Right. Awesome. That sounds really interesting. I'm definitely gonna go check that out. Um, I'm curious, say our, our listeners who, maybe they find this really interesting, just talking about hearing about EMDR. Um, you know, if I guess if they're in Vancouver, they could come see you. But what are there organizations, or is there something to look for? If someone did want to kind of go ahead and pursue that, what sort of recommendations would you give?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. Yeah, so obviously for me, it would be in BC. I can work with anybody in BC, and I'm expanding into some provinces and states now. But for just in general, if you're in Canada like me, there is emdrcanada.org. And you can link that up in the show notes for people.
Absolutely.
That will give you access to a directory of EMDR therapists throughout Canada. There is the EMDR International Association, or emdria.org, and that is literally therapists all over the world are part of this directory. So you can find probably somebody in your area. There are some spaces where we don't yet have therapists there, but and then there's also an EMDR Europe. So there's quite a few directories, but all you have to do is go onto one of those sites, type in your area, and you'll get a list of EMDR therapists. And the way that it works is there's basic therapists and there's certified therapists, approved consultants, and trainers. And so the more things that the therapist has behind their name, probably the more training that they're going to have. But there's so much, that has to go into it. So I would recommend finding somebody that looks appealing to you, and then click on their website, get a sense of the therapist personality. Because just because they do EMDR doesn't mean they're going to be a good fit for you. It has to be, it's a human relationship. So you have to find a good fit from that perspective as well. But EMDR is a pretty structured protocol, so it should be more or less the same.
Right on. Sweet. Well, Rob, I've had a great time talking with you on the show today. I'm curious, if listeners want to find out more about your work or your book, and we can link all this stuff in the show notes. But what sort of resources would you direct them towards?
Yeah, you can go to my website and contact me that way, grigorecounselling.com with two L's. And I also have some videos on YouTube, and there's a link on my website as well for some videos. But there's some great, remember we talked about the early stage in EMDR, the preparation stage. You can find out how to do a container and a calm place just by watching these videos that I made. And that's going to help to, lower some of the distress and allow you to cope a little bit better until you find an EMDR therapist. But there's so many other things too that people can do, like learning to meditate. There's apps, out there that you can do that. I think Headspace is one, and there's a great app that I love giving out to my clients called PTSD Coach, and I highly recommend using the American version. It's a little bit better than the Canadian one, but it'll help you identify what it is that you're feeling, and it'll suggest some coping strategies for you to take advantage of, and it builds, or sorry, it over time learns a little bit more about what you like, what you don't like, and then we'll start suggesting the ones that are good for you. And I think so. Those are some great resources I like to recommend to people. And if anybody has any questions, they can always shoot me an email right there from my contact form, and I'll answer.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, if you guys enjoyed the show today, go ahead and like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're Roscoe's Wetsuit. You can also find audio versions of the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. So go ahead, check us out which way you want. Rob, again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Toby. We could have probably talked for a couple of more hours, you know.
Agreed. We'll have to have you back on.
Lovely. And thank you so much to the listeners for having me too.
Absolutely.